Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we talk about a new significant development in the Kupyansk section of the front line, where following the rotation of Ukrainian Azov units from that direction, the Russians have managed to capture approximately 30 to 40 square kilometers in a single breakthrough. The Russians also continued advances across the Zherebets river line, in the Siversk section of the front line, and in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russian offensive operations continues north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have started fighting the Azov reinforcements that arrived from other sectors of the front line. These recent developments show a video of the Azov soldiers arriving at the front line, and while they are transporting the soldiers, the Russians already have drones searching for them as they are arriving, striking their positions while they are still unloading, and before they even unload any of the soldiers, these drones are flying and striking their positions. This also brings into perspective the response time of weapons. Drones, FPV drones especially, they can detect an enemy and directly strike them, while weapons such as artillery, airstrikes, FAB bombs, all the additional parts that are long-range heavy firepower, have a longer response time. This means when the Russians detect these vehicles unloading soldiers on the Ukrainian side, they have the option to either strike them themselves or keep reconnaissance of them and direct artillery fire or FAB bombs to their positions. However, there is a delay between shooting and the shot arriving when it comes to these long-range strikes, which means if the Ukrainians move in the meantime, the strike will not land on them, which is likely why they are focusing on using the FPV drones during these movements, because the Ukrainians, as seen from these videos, are isolated. They are driving these trucks one by one, the vehicles as well. This leaves the effectiveness of the Russian strikes to a minimum when they are not using FPV drones, as there is a high risk of completely missing them. If attacking with the FPV drone itself has a 100% chance of hitting, although the firepower is not enough to destroy the entire vehicle and all the soldiers within it, it will still leave many of the soldiers as casualties. That is why it is the most effective way right now for the Russians to strike these on the move. Unlike the Russian forces responding to the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, where they were struck in Rilsk, where they were having a convoy outside of the town that was standing still for a long time, those mistakes are what causes the most of these mass casualty events, where a large convoy is standing still within range of MLRS strikes just for more than 20 minutes or so will allow the other side, if they have an MLRS launcher in position, to strike those forces. And in the terms of the Kursk incursion, the Ukrainians had MLRS launchers within range for such strikes. Based on this, we can see that the Ukrainians are playing it right by having these dispersed vehicles driving up to send reinforcements to put up their positions within their fortified areas. However, the Russians are also well prepared for that and are taking full advantage of this rotation. Zodiac Maps made a comparison between the Ukrainian Kursk incursion and this advance north of Pokrovsk. Zodiac Maps writes, "The new Russian operation in Dobropilya may be reminiscent of last year's Ukrainian operation in Kursk. Small groups penetrated Russian territory, making significant advances in a short period of time. However, there is a significant difference between the two. First, Russian army did not use an initial mechanized force for the advances, but rather small assault groups following reconnaissance units, which initially led to acts of sabotage and the destruction of fortifications. Secondly, there is the question of scale. While Ukrainian army managed to capture an area of around 1,000 square kilometers, the area of the salient in Dobropilya ranges between 90 and 110 square kilometers, which guarantees Russia's logistical capabilities to avoid encirclement and heavy losses. Similar to what happened in Kursk, it is possible that the Russian offensive will be contained. However, unlike what happened in August 2024, Ukraine does not have enough manpower to stabilize the front without jeopardizing others, such as Kupyansk or Kupyansk. The arrival of Azov reinforcements north of Pokrovsk will come at a significant cost to the Ukrainian armed forces, which are unable to completely hold Russian forces despite the trench system created in recent months before the open territory leading to the Dnieper. And he is completely correct in his assessment that this will have consequences on the entire front line, as I also stated in my previous video. The example is here in the eastern bank of the Sqkm river line near Kupyansk. The Russians made a significant advance, capturing approximately 37 square kilometers of territory and entering Petropavlivka's outskirts from the eastern direction, gaining control over several lines of fortifications to the east of Kupyansk. All of this while the Russians are storming the city from the north. The Russians are now looking to gain full control over the Kupyansk pocket as well as the town itself, gaining control over the eastern bank of the Sqkm river line in the northern section, and gaining control over a new logistical hub for their forces on the western bank of the Sqkm river line. And they picked the exact time where the Ukrainians rotated their elite forces from one section of the front line to another to strike these positions, because the Ukrainians simply do not have the necessary manpower to continue plugging the gaps if the Russians are attacking simultaneously. This forced the Ukrainians to make a choice before the Russians took advantage of it. That means the Ukrainians fell directly into Russia's trap, and now we're seeing a battle over the remaining parts of Kupyansk. This will lead to a snowball effect where the Russians will continue down along the Sqkm river line to capture the entire eastern bank of it in the direction of Borova further south, as well as Liman in the southern section, with a lot of forces being freed up from the Kupyansk direction. With the additional logistical hub in Kupyansk itself, the Russians can also develop offensive operations in the northwestern and southwestern directions, as well as the western bank of the Sqkm river line in its entirety towards Izium, Volochyva, Balaklia, Chuhuiv, and the entire eastern bank of the river line northeast of Kharkiv, which means Russians may restart offensive operations to the east of Kharkiv city and establish their positions on the northern flank of the Donetsk region. The Russian advance here to the east of the Sqkm river line includes several fortified positions that were located along the forest lines. The Russians managed to capture all of them following many weeks of preparations, where they managed to secure the western flank of Sqkm and Vasilivka along the main highway. With this, the Russians managed to flank many of these fortified positions from the southern flank, allowing them to gain control over the first line of defense, from which they push onwards towards the second line of defense before the Ukrainians could properly position themselves. This allowed them to reach the outskirts of Petropavlivka, where the Ukrainians are putting up heavy resistance on their northern defensive line. This allows the Russians to now launch further offensive operations from the northern flank from the direction of Sinkivka and the forest patch area to re-enter Kupyansk and to start offensive operations towards Petropavlivka and Kocherivka here on the eastern bank. This also spreads out the Ukrainian defensive capabilities, as the Russians are simultaneously storming the western parts along the main parts of Kupyansk. With this, heavy pressure is taking place on the northern flank, and we may see significant developments here on the Kupyansk direction over the next weeks for the capture of Kupyansk and the eastern bank of the Sqkm river line alongside it. In the direction of Sarishne, the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the river line positions, the crossings across the Sherebets river line, developing the offensive operations towards Liman from the eastern flank. The Russians continue offensive operations in an attempt to gain control over Sarishne and the Serbiansky forest area on the northern flank of Siversk and eastern flank of Liman for developments on both of these sectors. Speaking of the Siversk direction, the Russians also expanded zone of control west of Novoselivka following the capture of the town. Russians are forcing the Ukrainians back towards the fortified positions west of the area, where the Ukrainians are holding up in their final fortified positions ahead of the defensive line in the Siversk direction. There is a separation between the northern and southern defensive lines here northeast of Siversk along the river line. And with the developments taking place in the Ivano-Derivka direction, where the Russians captured the fortified positions there, Russians may be looking to gain control over the fortified positions further along the river line south of Siversk, allowing for further advances by the Russians along the railway line near Vyemka towards the southern outskirts of Siversk. Taking a look at the fortifications, a direct storming of Siversk is difficult because of the multi-layered defensive line east of the town. Instead, the Russians, if they're able to take advantage of the fortified positions being isolated to the south of the town, manage to gain control over the positions overlooking the railway area. The Russians can storm the town from the south, which will allow them to isolate the supply lines to the southwest, and at the same time flank and bypass the defensive lines to the east. However, all of this is within close vicinity to Siversk, and it is still difficult to develop offensive operations on the southern flank of these fortifications, and the fortified positions themselves are also tough to push through. Therefore, the defense of Siversk will likely hold on for much longer, as the Russians still need to develop offensive operations within the Serbiansky forest area, Serbianka, and the fortified positions south of the town. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians managed to gain control over Andreevka Klevtsove, the entirety of the town. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians managed to gain full control of it, being geolocated in the southern, central, and northern parts of the town. Gaining control over the eastern bank of the Vovcha River line here allows them to secure this northern section, gain control over the remaining parts south of the river line, and then to redirect their forces towards Oleksandrorad here to the south, as well as the town of Komishovacha further southwest, which will allow them to gain full control over the border area between the Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia regions, all the way up to Muravka, southwest of Pokrovsk, in control over a wide area of the front line along the border area. Creating a strong defensive line along the Vovcha River line will allow the Russians to concentrate their forces on the first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, allowing them to focus on the southern bank of the river line. Advancing alongside these fortified positions and the roads thereof would allow the Russians to develop offensive operations, bypassing the defensive lines facing their directions, and allowing them to establish a flanking maneuver on Huliaipole, getting control over Huliaipole and the first and second defensive lines between the Donetsk region and Huliaipole will allow the Russians to have a significant presence and strong supply line leading directly into the southern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region and the rear of the Zaporizhia region, which will significantly strengthen offensive operations by the Russians moving in the northwestern direction. And as mentioned by Zodiac Map's analysis, beyond the current defensive lines we are seeing across the front line, there is just an open field all the way up to the Dnieper River. The Institute for the Study of War also stated that the Russians succeeding in their breakthrough north of Pokrovsk and gain control over the city would endanger their Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia regions, as well as Poltava itself, as the Ukrainians simply do not have prepared positions good enough to defend these locations if the Russians gain control over the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.